everyone. Today I'm going to do a presentation about poetry in 18th and 19th century. What is poetry? A type of literature based on the interplay of words and rhythm. It often employs rhyme and meter, a set of rules governing the number and arrangement of syllables in each line. The words are strung together to form sounds, ideas that might be too complex or abstract to describe directly. Poetry was once written according to very strict rules of meter and rhyme, and each culture had its own rules. For examples, Anglo-Saxon poets had their own rhyme schemes and meter, while Greek poets and Arabic poets had others. These classical forms are still widely used today. Modern poets frequently do away with rules altogether. Their poems generally do not rhyme and do not fit any particular meter. These poems, however, still have a rhythmic quality and seek to create beauty through their words. Definition of poetry according to several poets, such as William Wordsworth. I have said that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Sir Philip Sidney. Poetry is an art of imitation, representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. Robert Frost. Poetry is when an emotion has found its thought, and the thought has found words. Why do we study poetry? And what is its importance? In some cases, poetry can help build community among people, both through mutual self-expression and through people sharing poetry that they love with others. In many cases, poetry can also help scholars learn more about various periods of history and what the people who lived in those times felt and understood the world around them. Poetry can be a powerful teaching tool, helping students improve their literacy. It can also allow writers to express their emotion and allows readers to connect to those emotions. Poetry is also connected to aesthetics or the expression of what is beautiful in the world. Definition of poetry and its importance by Prof. Yusra Rashid.
Hey there! Today's video is about poetry and the importance of poetry in our world. And actually, when I think about poetry, two things pops into my mind. Two things that connect all of us. One, the experiences of life throwing us off balance. And two, the need to communicate these experiences. And actually, one of the things that teaching poetry has taught me over the years is that not only are we all linked by these experiences, but that we can all explore them in poetry. To move, to console, to inspire, and to gain from this sort of poetic exploration. These experiences actually range from love to loss, joy, and pain. And if you think about it, in a way, we are similar to poets. We use language to make comparison, to sound good. We use imagery, metaphor, music. We use language that represents sensory experiences and language that stimulates the senses of the reader. I always remember pieces of poetry throughout the day, actually, lines such as the worst enemy to creativity is self-doubt, which is such a genuine line I always tell my students about. Or Sylvia Plath when she once said, "Kiss me, and you'll see how important I am. It is such a beautiful arranging of words. Or William Shakespeare when he once said, "Oh, beware of jealousy. It's the green-eyed monster which does mock the meat it feeds on." Or his sonnets when he once said, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." So all my life, whenever we need poetry, we find it. We find poetry on labor, work, love, death, mourning, suffering, diaspora, and difference. So teaching, promoting, and helping people love poetry is a sort of a getaway from this sort of faulty language of everyday usage, get away from noisy and quick, rapid world around us. Because after all, poetry evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through chosen language that is arranged in a specific manner. And in this way, poetry can have a positive impact on the social and emotional learning. And it also helps us understand and appreciate the world around us. And when I think of poetry, I believe it reminds us that words can be so beautiful and that there is no shame in the art and the act of expression.
Before we get to know the characteristic of each era, we should first know when this era began and when it ended. The 18th century began in January 1, 1701 to December 31, 1800, which is called the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. 19th century began in January 1, 1801 to December 31, 1900, which is called the Victorian era. The era between the end of 18th century and the beginning of 19th century begins in 1800 to 1850, which is called Romanticism, also known as the Romantic movement or Romantic era. The characteristic of each era that inspired the poets to write their poems. The characteristic of the 18th century. When 18th century poets sat down to write a poem, they did not pour forth images for their souls. They attempted certain genres and looked to the ancients of inspiration and examples. Their voice and emotions were public rather than private, and they wrote about the present rather than about their own pasts. The characteristic of the 18th century. The 19th century poetry was known for its spontaneous emotional flow. Intense emotions supported and fed the new poetry. The entire gamut of human emotion: joy, love, fear, regret, hope, faith, were richly reflected in the poetry of Romantics. The most famous poets in the 18th and 19th century: Alexander Pope, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Frost, William Wordsworth, Shelley, John Keats, John Dryden, William Blake. Alexander Pope. He is a great new critic poet and critic in the 18th century. Pope is famous for a number of works, including Essay on a Man, The Rape of the Lock, and his famous political and essay on criticism. His works are often marked by putting satire and emphasis on form. In particular, The Rape of the Lock is a good example. The Rape of the Lock was written by Alexander Pope and first published in 1712 then reworked and published again in 1714. The poem is mock epic that satirized the upper class in London at that time. This version is 5 cantos long and includes Clarice's speech, which aids in describing the morality behind the poem. In The Rape of the Lock, Pope used Belinda and the Baron to mock two of his friends, Arabella Fermor and Lord Peter. The poem follows the events of the night, leading up to Belinda's horrific close. The Rape of the Lock summary is quite simple, based on a true story told to Pope by a friend. The poem tells of how the Baron sneakily cuts off a lock of Belinda's hair at a party, which causes her to become aged enough to start fight. The story ends undramatically with the lock of hair becoming lost to both Belinda and the Baron. While the story itself is straightforward, Pope created a long poem around 600 lines broke up into 5 cantos. A canto, coming from the Latin word for song, is a section of a long narrative poem. If the entire poem, The Rape of the Lock, is an album, think of each canto as one song on the album. The literary devices figures of speech in The Rape of the Lock. Hyperbole, use language to emphasize a point, is actually to make something more dramatic. Anaphora, a word or expression, is repeated at the beginning of a number of sentence clauses or phrases. Alliteration, the repetition of the same sound at or near the beginning of each word in straight syllables. Metaphor is a composition between two different things without using as or like. Simile, it directly compares two things using as, like, resembles, or than. Metonymy, the name of an object or concept is replaced with a word closely related by the original. Personification, an idea is giving human traits and or feeling or is spoken of as if it were human. Allusions, a passing descriptive reference to something. Imagery, to create effect of an idea with the help of images. The hyperbole. The main figure of speech in The Rape of the Lock is hyperbole. Examples. Canto 1. So through white curtains shot a time rose ray, and op those eyes that must eclipse the day. Bob has made Belinda's eyes so bright that they outshine a ray of sunlight. Canto 2. The sniff to the destruction of mankind, nor shed two locks which graceful hung behind. Belinda is so beautiful and her wondrous locks are so inviting that she can bring mankind to reign with desire. Anaphora. Canto 1. What dear offense amorous cases brings, what mighty constants rise from trivial things. Canto 5. Why dig with all that land and sea offered? Why angels called and angels like adored? Why round our coaches crowd the wide-gloved bows? Why bows the tide pokes from its inmost rows? Alliteration. Canto 1. Slide is the subject, but not so the praise. Canto 1. Bows punched paws, and coaches drive. Also Canto 1. Where wigs, with soured knots strive. Metaphor. Canto 1. They shift the moving toy shop of their heart. Comparison of the warmth of a young woman to the toy shop of the heart. Canto 5. When those fair suns shall set, as set they must. Comparison of Belinda's eyes to the sun. Simile. Canto 2. Bright as the sun, her eyes, the gazers strike, and like the sun, they shine on all alike. Comparison of the brightness of the Belinda's eyes to the brightness of the sun. Comparison of Belinda's gaze to the shining sun. Autonomy. Canto 2. And mighty hearts are held in slender chains. Use of her to present Belinda's male lovers. Burnification. Canto 2. To sniff to the destruction of mankind. Nor should two locks which graceful hang behind, in equal curls, and well conspired to deck, with shining ringlets, her smooth every neck. The two locks conspire. Allusions. There are two types of reference in the rape of the lock. One, literary and philosophical reference. Two, historical reference. 1. Literary and philosophical reference. Homer, Iliad. Homer, Odyssey. Atlantis. Virgil, Aeneid. Shakespeare, Othello. Parnassus. 2. Historical reference. John Carroll, Ampere, Lou, The River, Thomas, Hampton Court, Queen Anne of England, Hyde Park, The River Meander, Rosamunda's Lock in St. James Park, Galileo, John Partridge. Imagery. There are two types of imagery in the Rape of the Lock, which are classical and epic imagery and religious imagery. Classical and epic imagery. Invoking the gods and muses like the beginning of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. Belinda's preparation for the party just like the arming of an epic hero for battle. The parents' plotting of getting at Belinda's hair is like classical epic heroes' planning. Belinda's petticoat is called a sevenfold fence, is a direct reference to the famous shield of Ajax described in Book 7 of the Iliad. Ariel admonishes like selves with dire punishments like Epic's punishment. The symbols and the themes. The symbols, a mark or a sign or a word that indicates, signifies, or representing an idea, object, or relationship. The luck. Belinda's luck symbolizes the absurdity of the importance given to female beauty in society. Cards. The playing cards symbolize the trivial of life at court. The bodkin. Belinda's bodkin symbolize the stories, swords, and spears used by heroes in epic poems. The themes. A main idea or an underlying meaning of a literary work, conveyed by an author and interpreted by a reader. Human vanity. The fuss that high society makes over trifling matters. The importance of being able to laugh at life's little reversals. Now let's have a brief idea about trends in modern poetry and its main characteristic by Dr. Ali Mustafa.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This is Dr. Ali Mustafa giving you a brief idea about trends in modern poetry and its main characteristics. Dear students, you know all that 20th century poetry is a curious mixture of the traditional and the experimental, of the old and the new. It is complex, it is many-sided, it is mainly a mixture of the old and the new. One of the leading characteristics of poetry of the new era is the abundance of output. Means that a great quantity of modern writings or publications was published, and this abundance of output has naturally resulted in the lowering of quality. Much that is published fails to achieve the highest standards. Modern age is an age of great poetry. Each writes according to his own mood and temper, producing poems accordingly to their moods. It is an age of anthologies, which bring together the select works of several hands for the delight of the readers. Another characteristic of modern poetry is break from tradition. The new poetry is a poetry of revolt, resulting largely from the impact of science. This kind of revolt can be seen in form and in the form and the content of poetry. Another characteristic also, humanitarianism, which means a deepened sense of pity for the poor and suffering. Actually, it is a leading characteristic of modern poetry. The spread of democracy has made the poet more and more conscious of the dignity of man. So attention is focused on their problems, and society is held responsible for their problems. Another trend or another characteristic, which is realism and pessimism. The new poetry is realistic, and the poet was concerned to convey the bitter reality of life. The Great War also was a nerve-shattering experience. Man has lost faith in values, in the accepted values. As a consequence, you find this sense of bitterness in the writings of the poets, such as the great poet T.S. Eliot. If you look at The Wasteland, Eliot's most important work, you find that it reflects the gloom, the tragic gloom that is explicit in the post-war world. It is mostly a poetry of despair, and it is also reflected in the poem. Despite this tragic note, yet you find in the works of the most pessimistic poets of the modern age satire, humor, jokes, sometimes even serious subjects are treated in the poetry of Odin and others in a tone of flippancy, and levity. Another characteristic, which is the revival of religious faith, mysticism, as a result of science and the spirit of rationalism, the poet became skeptical about God. You find, for example, Thomas Hardy laughs ironically at God, and the houseman does not call him a brute or a blackguard. But this does not mean that religion is no longer a source of inspiration in the new poetry. In T.S. Eliot and Francis Thompson, we find a revival of Christian mysticism. Side by side with mysticism, we find also another characteristic, which is interest in the metaphysical poets, especially in the works of John Donne and the other metaphysical poets of the 17th century. So besides the influence of science, religion, and mysticism, we have many other influences at work on the modern poetry, mainly, or one of which is metaphysical poetry and the revival of its startling, far-fetched imagery, to capture the attention of the reader. And this is quite clear in Odin's imagery and poetry. Again, also we find a romantic note and symbolism in modern poetry. Despite its realism in theme and treatment, there is also a touch or a vein of romanticism. We have romantic longing for a more perfect world. Poets liked to escape into a fairyland. We find also the theme of love as a dominant theme in modern poetry. And W.B. Yeats has been called the greatest love poet of the 20th century. Modern poetry also is influenced by the techniques of music, sculpture, painting, and other fine arts. We find that the modern poet freely uses the vocabulary and techniques of other arts. We see C.E. Cummings reducing his poems to mere topographical designs. Also, the variations and repetitions in T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land are like the movements of a symphony. Also, we find the technique of cinematograph is exploited by Eliot in his great poem Wasteland. We find unrelated scenes are presented to create a dramatic situation, like shots of unrelated scenes in a movie. To add to this also, the modern poet is constantly experimenting with new verse forms and poetic techniques. The use of slang and colloquial language has become common. The bonds of meter have been loosened. The use of verse libre has become increasingly common. No rules of rhyme or meter are followed. Stresses vary according to emotion. Also, under the influence of modern psychologists like Freud, Jung, and Bergson, we find the depiction of the subconscious and unconscious has become a commonplace. Emphasis has shifted from the externals to the rendering of the psyche. These are some of the major characteristics or trends of modern poetry. We have so many, two main or some great poets like T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, The Second Coming, which predicts the deterioration of the Western civilization and the beginning of a new civilization, a new Eastern civilization, symbolized by Sphinx. This is a very brief idea about some of the trends and characteristics of modern poetry. Good luck, Dr. Ali Mustafa.
Thanks for watching.